Greetings and welcome to Kant's Theory of Action, Acting on Maxims. This comes from a book from the Oxford Press about Kant's theory of action, and the chapter is focusing on acting on maxims. And as that applies to a lot of the driving forces of our courts, it pays us good reason to investigate it further. That being said, let's get right down to it. Acting on maxims, and this is taken from, let's get over here, give me a second. Let's get to the cover page here. Richard McCarty, and from the Oxford University Press. Let's get started here. So, acting on maxims. Maxims are central to Kant's moral theory. Before we go any further, I just want to ask anyone that's in here to go ahead and pipe up in the chat or let me know that audio is coming through loud and clear, and we'll continue. Before we talk about Kant's moral theory, unless you're a philosophy major or you studied philosophy to some extent, you probably have no idea who Kant is, let alone his moral theory. And since he asked, we should probably get into that because I'm not a philosophy major either. And that being said, I put together a little primer here to get us up to date on exactly what Kant's moral theory is based on, and in general, where the philosophy of Kant, which is the idealist tradition, and how it relates to the topic we're about to discuss. So let's jump over to that really quick to a little primer I put together here. So there's two classic epistemological polar opposites in the 18th century, can be usefully presented by Hume in the British empiricist tradition, and Kant in the German idealist tradition. So epistemological, so the theory of knowledge, how we know what we know and how we come about to know it, etc. But the theory of knowledge, and the two classic epistemological polar positions. So these are the polar positions, not necessarily opposite, but polar positions in the 18th century, can be usefully represented by two good examples here. Hume in the British empiricist tradition, and Kant in the German idealist tradition. We will crudely sketch these positions. Now, we're going to be focusing on Kant, but just to give a quick example of what the idealist tradition relates to, we're looking at it in respect to its polar opposite, which is the empiricist tradition. And this is all going to the 18th century now. We're going back in time, way back. The basic organizing principle in the empiricist tradition was alarmingly simple. There is nothing in the mind which did not come from the senses. A position like this, when baldly presented as we have articulated it here, seems disturbingly incomplete. And this is correct. The context in which it was formulated is missing. If you had been raised in an environment where learned men were hotly debating the number of angels who could dance on the head of a pin, the above empiricist doctrine would have been a breath of fresh air. So we're back to the 18th century, and here you have the most learned men of the time hotly debating on the number of angels who could dance on the head of a pin. That kind of nonsense would make the empiricist doctrine that there is nothing in the mind which did not come from the senses would be like a breath of fresh air. The difficulty with the position is that it rejects human beings as active agents in creating experience. More fundamentally, it cannot account for one of the most elementary experiences of the human condition. Two human beings witnessing the same real-world event will subsequently provide differences in their individual accounts of what occurred. Differences which become more numerous as one demands more and more detail in their accounts. So now you see where we're getting into the elements of law and maxims here. But right now we're looking at it here, right, from the empiricists, the polar opposite of the perspective we're about to investigate it through. On the other pole in this controversy was Kant, who bit off a lot more than was either chewable or digestible. The famous Kantian solution was to assign each human being a set of innate, genetically specified categories through which we experience the world, what we call in the forwarding document perceptual filters. Kant certainly recognizes with his innate categories of perception a tremendous contribution to experience on the part of human beings involved. Ultimately, however, the cost is exorbitant. If our experiences are the result of deeply set filters, independent of the real world, then our ability to know the world starts to deteriorate rapidly, and the world begins to get rather slippery. So the adaptability, right, is essential to having a realistic look at the world. And if you don't have that realistic look, then everything starts to, in this set of your filters, the world deteriorates rapidly and decision making becomes rather slippery. It is amusing to note that Kant's position settles into an equally unattractive consequence at the individual level with respect to the same difference of perception issue on which Hume failed. Either Kant similarly cannot account for differences in perception, or must assign them to faulty neurological developments of the innate categories. Again, these are categories that you're born with, they're set in your genes, they can't adapt. In either case, we believe Bateson would have commented, shoddy epistemology. Bateson was another one in the synthetic tradition, of which I would have to say is one I would prefer to be looking at philosophy from, in such the synthetic abstractionists. There are 2 points on which both of these epistemological positions are quite unsatisfactory. First, note that in both cases, there's little room for individual responsibility. If the real world impresses certain sensations on the individual neurology as a function of the physical properties of the stimulus, or if we experience the stimulus sensations solely as a function of innate perceptual categories, the question of personal responsibility is moot. So again, this is trying to have it condensed here because we need to get to the main topic, but if the real world imposes or impresses certain sensations on the individual neurology, right, these categories, innate categories, as a function of the physical properties of the stimulus, right? So in other words, what is being impressed into that neurology is a function of the physical properties of the stimulus, or if we experience the stimulus sensation solely as a function of the innate perceptual categories, the question of personal responsibility is moot. Do you understand what this means here? Is that, is it the physical properties of the stimulus, or is it the function of the innate perceptual categories that are impressing certain sensations? Right? And if that's it, then the question of personal responsibility is moot. So again, we're not looking at there's little room for individual responsibility in either of these philosophies. So what we're doing here is just trying to drive the needle here and split apart the fine distinctions here in philosophical approaches, but seeing how there'll be aspects of both of these interwoven into our American jurisprudence style of law. The second point is the way these positions fall out with respect to the mind-body split. Hume and his troupe are condemned to wander about, remember the empiricist Hume, they're condemned to wander about entertaining all and only experiences which are sensory-based, while Kant and his band sit immobilized, locked into their individual neurologies. Hume and the empiricist have the task of freeing themselves from the tyranny of an exclusively sensory world, while Kant and his idealists, trapped in mental categories, trying to find a way back out to the real world. Those readers who have experience working professionally with mental patients will recognize these two positions as characteristic syndromes of patient populations. Thus, with respect to the mind-body issue, the empiricists have make do with pattern exclusively in the physical world. Psychology collapses into physics, such as with Freud, right? While the idealists must fight for and justify each and every link from their starting position, the mind, to the world. If any such connections can be demonstrated, how would we know? In fact, the mentalist position, unburdened with any anchor to the physical world, historically tends to float off in the direction of spiritualism. So, we're not looking into this approach here. We're looking at where we've evolved from both the Kantian, the idealist tradition, and the empiricist tradition. And we see today we have more of a hybrid, the synthetic approach, where taking the patterns, not necessarily the content of any of these positions here, and assembling the new ways to explain the reality around us and to make proper predictions and proper decisions. Okay, with that being said, I hope everyone appreciated that little digression from the main topic. And let's check over here with the chat really quick. And then we're going to be getting right down to the main source here. Greens to Liberty Absurdity. And Couples Light. And Lascara says, the one that pressures and the one that gets pressured. Yeah, and when you're looking from these philosophical approaches, is it the pressure from the stimulus, or is it the internal representation filters that create the impression on the individual? You know, does the bear scare you? Is it your impression of the bear that scares you? Yeah, it gets pretty deep, but I want to just give that as an outline. It is a bit of a digression, but however, once you understand where I just described these traditions, you'll further understand where we're getting through here on the maxims here, acting on maxims, and you'll see exactly what I mean by the moral theory here. And none of this will seem foreign now because you've got a strong background of the fine points of contention within that theory. Of course, this is going back to the 18th century, but these things still apply. These are timeless, ultimate truths. Let's continue. Wrong one. Should be this one there. There we go. Okay. Acting on maxims. Oops. Okay, here we go. Acting on maxims. Maxims are central to Kant's moral theory. So are imperatives. Both concepts are borrowed from the structure of practical reasoning, by which, in Kant's theory of action, our actions are supposed to be justified. For similar purposes of other theories of action employ concepts like desires and intentions, means and ends, and reasons for action. A principal aim of this chapter is to show how the maxims and imperatives of Kant's theory of action relate to these more familiar concepts employed by other theories. So here we're going to get some deep understanding of some of these concepts like desires, intentions, means, ends, and reasons for actions, and actions that are supposed to be justified. Another aim of this chapter will be to set the agenda for the book. This occurs toward the end. We're not going to get through this whole book, where a question will be raised about the relation between practical reasoning and action. Very broadly, the question will be, is practical reasoning supposed to merely justify action, or can it also explain it? More narrowly, the question is, are the conclusions of practical reasoning just advice or recommendations about how we ought to act? Or can practical reasoning actually issue in actions as conclusions following from its premises? Interesting here, and this is where we're building into the maxims. I think Kant's view was that practical reasoning both justifies and explains action. Practical reasoning justifies and explains action. Seems to me that most writers on Kant's practical philosophy are convinced of this also, but I do not find among them a satisfactory explanation of how practical reasoning can do both. So, near the end of the chapter, which we'll get to tonight, I'll pose a problem related to the practical reason's ability both to justify and to explain action. See, we can justify, we can describe, but explain, right, allows us to drive action, right? The solution I'll offer for this problem will be a central contribution of this book. And in order to develop and clarify this solution, it will be necessary to set out the basic principles of Kant's theory of human motivation, which is the objective of the next chapter. Here we begin with a brief statement about what Kant thought action is, and proceeded from there to explain his concept of a maxim. Next follows a section on the role of maxims in practical reasoning. After that, maxims will be connected with some more familiar concepts in action theory, concepts like desire, intention, and will. An explanation of the role of imperatives in practical reasoning will then follow. This will pave the way near the end for exploring the problem posed by our leading question, the question about whether practical reason merely justifies action or also explains it. So, we're trying to see if practical reasoning is just justifying the action it compels or explains it as well. Action. Kant understood action as making a difference in the world. His reason for thinking of action so broadly will become clear in a later chapter. Here it will suffice to point out that his most general term referring to action is Handlung, which encompasses everything done by human beings, as well as by every other causal agent in the world. In a lecture, he once defined action broadly as the determination of the power of a substance as a cause of a certain accident. The determination of the power of a substance as a cause of a certain accident. You see, we're getting into things that get into legal terms, causes of action, accidents, determinations. We may think of the human mind as a substance and of an intentional bodily movement as a type of accident. If we do, then the mind's causally linking or causally determining this movement through its own power would fall under Kant's broader definition of action. But it would also would a billiard so also would a billiard ball's rolling or a cup of water's freezing. So we're thinking of the mind as a substance and intentional bodily movement as a type of accident, then this is strange, because if we do, then we look at the mind as causally determined the movement through its own power. It would fall under a broader definition of action, but it would also, would a billiard ball's rolling or a cup of water's freezing? Indeed it would. Kant's technical term for the type of action of primary interest to moralists and action theorists is deed. So we see from Latin, and we'll see this in our German terms too, our legal terms too, actus and factum, in German that. He defined this term as follows: an action is called a deed insofar as it comes under obligatory laws, and hence insofar as the subject, in doing it, is considered in terms of the freedom of his choice. So a deed, insofar it comes under obligatory laws, right? Common law or natural laws, and hence insofar as the subject, in doing it, is considered in terms of the freedom of his choice. So the terms of the freedom of the choice right, of that subject. The deed. An action is called a deed when it comes under these obligatory laws, right, that allow this freedom of choice within this framework of laws. By such an action, the agent is regarded as the author of its effect. And this, together with the action itself, can be imputed to him. Imputed. Several selections of this chapter immediately following present explanations of other technical terms Kant used to explain his concept of action in the sense of a deed. We begin with the term maxim. Let's look at these footnotes here, but before we do that, let's jump over here to the chat. All right, I'm glad you enjoyed that, Lascara and Couples Light. And again, depending on the person's awareness from this perspective here. So some pretty deep concepts here, and you see as we're getting deeper in here, you get to understand where the rubber meets the road as far as you could say the lawful rubber meets the legal road is where these thoughts are driven to action. So let's get back to these footnotes here. Concept of causality leads to the concept of action. This to the concept of force, and thereby to the concept of substance. Interesting. For according to the principle of causality, actions are always the primary ground of all change of appearances. Interesting one there too. Okay, let's get to the section 1-2 here on maxims. Most of what is known about Kant's theory of action comes from his moral theory, which, as a theory of action evaluation, contains an implicit theory of action. That's what we're focusing on here. The moral theory's primary evaluative principle, the categorical imperative, as we read before, the innate categories, right? The categorical imperative indicates that actions can be evaluated as morally right or wrong based on their maxims. Kant defined a maxim as a subjective principle of volition or of acting. But these are not especially helpful definitions, and a number of disputes over how to interpret his moral theory revolve around the correct understanding of his concept of a maxim. We are fortunate that Kant provided several examples of maxims in illustrating how to apply the categorical imperative. Categorical imperative, right? And what was the other thing we saw here about within the insofar as comes under obligatory laws. So see, this is all weaving together here. So the categorical imperative. A very simple example is to let no insult pass unavenged. Some more complicated examples are to shorten my life when its longer duration threatens more troubles than it promises agreeableness. Wow. To shorten my life when its longer durations threatens more troubles than it promises agreeableness. And when I believe myself to be in need of money, I shall borrow money and promise to repay it, even though I know this will never happen. Wow, that's an interesting one there. Our interest in maxims here and throughout the chapters to follow will focus on how they function in practical reasoning. We're sticking with this chapter here on maxims. From the assumption in Kant's moral theory that actions can be evaluated by their maxims, we can infer his assumption that every action has a maxim. Every action has a maxim. Every action has a maxim. Most commentators are convinced that human actions can be distinguished from other causes in the world by their relations to maxims. Maxims seem to be essential for human actions, and for this reason I shall assume throughout this book that something has gone wrong if we arrive at a point where we must admit that a human action is not related to or is not in the normal way based on a maxim. I think most commentators will agree also that in Kant's theory of action, maxims are presumed to rationalize actions. Kant's theory of action, maxims are presumed to rationalize actions. We get some tongue twisters here. For any action having occurred, its maxim is supposed to give the reason for it in some sense. So let's look at the footnotes here before we go further here. On footnote 4 was for, let's see where to go. Here we go. Subjective principle of volition or of acting. That's what the maxim is, a subjective principle. Subjective applying to the subject. It's a principle of volition or acting. And that comes from the groundwork of the metaphysics of morals, critique of practical reason, okay, and metaphysics of morals. Okay, we're on here to the subjective principles. As subjective principles, remember they're subjective, maxims are to be distinguished in Kant's theory of action from objective principles, which are called laws or imperatives. A law or imperative will indicate a course of action that ought rationally to be done. Kant described the difference between maxims and laws or imperatives as follows. All right, so pay attention here. The former, a maxim, contains the practical rule determined by reason conformably with the conditions of the subject, often his ignorance or also his inclinations, and is therefore the principle in accordance with which the subject acts. But the law is the objective principle valid for every rational being, and the principle in accordance with which he ought to act. This suggests how Kant assumed that how we act depends always upon what seems reasonable to us, given our knowledge or lack of it, and our subjective prompts to actions. The latter would include desires or inclinations, but might not be limited to these. Give me one moment here. All right. Everything looking good. Let's continue. The maxim principles upon which we act reflect this kind of qualified reasonableness. Which we can here call subjective reasonableness. Qualified, we read about this before, as qualified electors as opposed to sovereign electors. So this is where the qualification, right? This is based on the subject, is qualified, meaning they're conforming to certain bounds within the, what was it? He said the laws. Hang on, let's get back over here. There's a pretty good wording here. I just want to get this again. But the, okay, well, either way. A lot of terms here. We can always go back and check and see because I did go over it a couple times there. But either way, the essential thing here to know The objective principles are called laws or imperatives, and a law will indicate a course of action that ought rationally to be done. Kant describes the difference between maxims and laws as following here. Again, the ignorance or inclinations based on the subject and that practical rule conforming with the conditions of the subject. This suggests that Kant assumed. All right, do we get the rest of this? Okay, but the law is, all right, let's read this one more time to make sure I got it all. I just wanted to clarify one thing here because this gets quite confusing. I know if I'm losing track of it, the thread in my mind, then the audience may as well. So it's good to go back over it and ensure we have a good, strong footing here. All right, the former maxim, a maxim. So a maxim contains the practical rule determined by reason, conformably within the conditions of the subject, often his ignorance, but also his inclinations, and is therefore the principle in accordance with which the subject acts. But the law is the objective principle valid for every rational being, and the principle in accordance with which he ought to act, an imperative. So, the law says what every rational being should do, whereas the maxim is the practical rule determined by reason conformably within the conditions of the subject. So that's with how a subject acts. The law is how he ought to act. So the maxim contains conditions of a subject, whereas a law is just for the rational being. This suggests that Kant assumed that how we act depends always upon what seems reasonable to us, given our knowledge or lack of it, and our subjective prompts to actions. So one moment here. Okay, we're back there. The latter would include desires or inclinations, but might not be limited to those. So again, we're conditions here, right? That how we act always depends on what seems reasonable to us given our knowledge. So again, the subject, depending on his ignorance or inclinations, given our knowledge or lack of it, and our subjective prompts to action. So the latter, lack of it, would include desires or inclinations, but might not be limited to these. The maxim principles upon which we act reflect this kind of qualified reasonableness, which we can here call subjective reasonableness. But how we rationally ought to act independently of our ignorance or our inclinations is expressed by laws and imperatives. These may be called principles of objective reasonableness. Now, this is actually legal terminology too in a lot of ways. Objective reasonableness. Imperatives will be discussed more fully below. Before they can be explained properly, it is necessary to understand several more points about acting on maxims, and especially the structure of maxim-based practical reasoning. All right, so we're getting deep in here. We're getting into the practical syllogism. So let's bounce over here to the chat and catch up with that. Do we still have everyone here, or have I lost everyone? Because we're getting deep into philosophy, and I know this isn't the most popular topic on YouTube. However, I think that where this actually has an intersection with the law and the way a lot of the courts function and even government into our lives, that it's important that we understand this. Again, we don't want our ignorance to be the subject of qualified conditions. Excellent. We have audit them here in the house. Greens audit them. Right, we're on to the practical syllogism. So we're looking at logic here. If maxims provide reasons for action, then a structure of rational argument seems like an appropriate model for relating maxims to actions. They provide reasons for action, so we could put a structure of rational argument as an appropriate model for relating maxims to actions. It seems that our actions should be representable as following somehow from our maxims in the way that conclusions follow from premises. Let's look at these footnotes here. See Kant's distinction between objectively and subjectively practical reason at practical reason. Okay. Notes from one of Kant's lectures show that he explained to his students that a maxim is the major premise of a practical syllogism. Maxims were defined this way also in their textbook. And among Kant's contemporary readers, it was common to think about action and practical reasoning in terms of the practical syllogism. This is because of the influential theories of Christian Wolff, one of the most well-known and prolific writers of the German Enlightenment. Wolff's simplistic model for the reasoning structure of the practical syllogism was as follows. 1. X is good. 2. Doing Y will achieve X. Therefore, doing Y is good. Statement 1 in this model, the major premise, is what Wolff called the maxim. So X is good, that's your maxim. 2, doing Y will achieve X, which is good. Therefore, doing Y is good. So if X is the maxim, X is good. By doing Y, you will achieve the good X, which is the maxim, right? The major premise. We'll get back to those footnotes. Kant was frequently critical of Wolff's philosophical views, especially in his lectures, but there seems to be no record of his ever having criticized Wolff's conception of maxims and of their role in practical syllogism. Nor did Kant ever offer any alternative explanation of what maxims are, nor of how they function in practical reasoning. He relied on the concept of a maxim to make crucial points in his moral theory. Yet in his presentations of that theory, his explanations of maxims are cryptic at best. It seems therefore most likely that Kant assumed maxims were already well enough understood by his audience through their acquaintance with Wolff's practical philosophy. That makes sense. Why would he want to give Wolff all the credit while he's doing the lecture? You know, this is like the lecture circuit back then. Oh boy. So we got footnote 6, and that is referring to conclusions. So this is the way we're applying the syllogisms to maxims in the way conclusions follow premises. All right, let's read this. As I see it, there's necessarily a maxim behind every rational voluntary action, and usually more than one. More than one maxim behind every rational and voluntary action. I think this is implied by the assumption in Kant's ethical theory that every action is either obligatory, wrong, or morally permissible. If the categorical imperatives formula of universal law is really the complete, supreme moral principle Kant said it is, then it must be able to determine whether any action is obligatory, wrong, or permissible. Since it is supposed to be able to do this by testing the maxim of any action, it allows that every action can be judged either obligatory, wrong, or permissible. It is based on a maxim. So that's your major premise. This conclusion, which seems to be confirmed by Kant's statement quoted in the following note, is contrary to the conclusion reached by several others. These interpreters view maxims as guiding principles that agents consult only in moral deliberation, as if the great majority of our actions are not based on maxims. Another look at maxims, and this is Essays in Honor. Okay. So you see the opposing view. I kind of agree with this author here more so. Action is voluntary insofar as it comes about according to maxims. Maxims are principles practically subjective, because they would be the major premise in practical syllogisms. The ethics text Kant used in his teaching career referred to a maxim as the, well, I'm not reading that. See Alexander Gottlieb's, whatever, okay. Wolff schematized and Enthymemic practical practical syllogism as follows. This thing or circumstance is of such and such character. Therefore, it is good or evil. The premise to be found would be this: a thing or circumstance of such and such character is good or evil. And hereby the maxim reveal. Okay, well, we're really battering some points here. Every legitimate action that a human being undertakes, he silently makes the following rational inference. Whenever the property A is encountered, my duty requires me to do B. The present case has the property A. Therefore, so on. The major premise of this rational inference is a maxim, a general rule of life, which we adopted at some earlier time, and which must naturally come to mind on the occasion of the present case. So we're looking at this here. Whenever the property A is encountered. So property characteristics, the expressions of a principle is encountered. My duty requires me to act to do B. The present case has this particular property, therefore, and so on. So you see the syllogisms here. Kant was frequently critical of Wolff's philosophical views, especially in his... we already got that part. Wolff was a mind-body dualist, and he relied on Leibniz's doctrine of pre-established harmony to explain how ideas or representations in the mind coordinate with bodily movements. He explained the soul as a power of representation. But he did not mean that the soul is a mental substance, remember, with a power of representation. He meant that the soul is literally a power of representation. He thought that in order to act, we must first represent what we will do in a special way. We must represent our action in a manner appropriate for God's having related our representation of it to our body's movement when he created the world. Whenever we act, we must represent our doing something as good or our omitting doing it as bad. This is the form of concluding thought in the Wolffian practical syllogism, doing Y is good. And because of its unique relation to bodily movement, Wolff called this thought a moving reason or a motive. See where motive comes from. Doing Y is good, or omitting doing it is bad. Motive. Moving reason. But he did not suppose that moving thoughts like this simply happen in the mind. Rather, he thought that for rational minds like ours, they would follow from representations of objects or conditions as good to bring about, which are major premises of practical reasoning, that is, maxims. They would also presuppose causal judgments as minor premises about how to act in order to bring about those objects or conditions represented as goods. Causal judgments in order to bring conditions represented as good, to bring them about, or objects. Remedy, reparation, redress. All right, let's continue here. First, let's jump over here to the chat. Hope everyone is still here. Hard to keep everyone on board here for philosophy, but this definitely is one where it is thought into action and it has practical applications. And of course, you see that right in the text. So let's continue. But today, to today's students of Kant's moral theory, everyone here in the audience, it might initially seem that he must have disagreed with Wolff's conception of maxims. None of the examples of maxims we read in his writings on moral theory seems to fit the Wolffian format after all. Yet, it is relatively easy to adapt Kant's examples of maxims to play the role of major premises in the practical syllogism. So he's using the concept of maxims from the Wolffian format, but he's using it to play the role of the major premise in his syllogism, the practical syllogism here, the logical reasoning or argument. A Wolffian maxim always represents something as good or as bad, the dualism, right? So, the maxim's formal predicate need not be included in its statement if we understand beforehand that we are being given an example of a maxim. When Kant wrote, "To let no insult pass unavenged," as a simple example of someone's maxim, he could have expected his readers to understand this as an expression of the person's thinking of this policy as good. Kant's examples of maxims taking the form of conditional statements, maxims taking the form of conditional statements can be adapted similarly. The person contemplating acting on the principle, when I believe myself to be in the need of money, to borrow money, and to promise to repay it, even though I know this will never happen, can be imagined to think that acting on this complex conditional policy would be good. Although Wolff's schema for the practical syllogism contains just a few simple statements, it can be easily extended to a practical sorites, or a polysyllogism. In this way, the reasoning behind our actions can include hierarchies of action policies. In one of Kant's more complicated examples of how to evaluate a maxim by the categorical imperative, remember the categorical imperative, the innate categories of Kantian philosophy, he considered a man contemplating sewers. His maxim is, from self-love, I make it my principle to shorten my life when its longer duration threatens more troubles than it promises agreeableness. This seems to be a maxim for maxim making. Its complexity suggests a chain of reasoning from a very general maxim through intermediate maxims of lesser generality to a motivating conclusion. The moving reason. Something like the following. My happiness, i.e. self-love, is good, maxim 1. 2. By experiencing more agreeableness than troubles, I satisfy my self-love, judgment. Wow. 3. Therefore, from self-love, I make it my principle that, acting in order to experience more agreeableness than troubles is good, maxim 2. By shortening my life when its longer duration threatens more troubles than agreeableness, I will experience more agreeableness than troubles, another judgment. Therefore, from self-love, I make it my principle that, shortening my life when its longer duration threatens more troubles than agreeableness is good, maxim 3. 6. My life's longer duration now threatens more troubles than agreeableness, judgment, again. 7. Therefore, by shortening my life now is good, maxim 4. 8. By jumping off this bridge now, I will shorten my life, judgment. 9. Therefore, jumping off this bridge now is good, Wolffian motive. Wow, that's heavy. We can see here in statement 5 how Kant's complicated example of the Sewer's maxim can be integrated into a practical sorites. It is helpful to point out here that Kant distinguished two kinds of maxims. There are maxims of action and maxim of ends. Now we were looking before about the desires, means, ends, actions, reasons of action. Here we have maxims of action now, maxims of ends. The first maxim in the above example would be a maxim of ends, since it is a simple statement that something, happiness, is good to bring about. The rest are maxims of action that express the goodness of ways of acting or of policies of action. They are all derived by inferences of practical reasoning from the leading maxim, in descending degrees of generality. In the final conclusion of this reasoning, called a motive by Wolff, represents a particular action as something good to do here and now. From this mental representation, the relevant movement of the body could be expected to follow because of the way God has ordered the matter of the world, at least according to Wolff. Kant did not follow Leibniz and Wolff's thinking in the minds and bodies as related through pre-established harmony, however, so he did not think it would be up to God to connect the thoughts that conclude our practical reasoning with our body's movements. His own explanation of how we get from maxims in the mind to the behavior in the external world is not something we can pursue here. Sorry, guys. It will suffice for now to say that Kant recognized certain kinds of mental representations as themselves capable of causing intentional body movements. Certain kinds of mental representations as themselves capable. He recognized this. That's interesting here. Certain kinds of mental representations as themselves capable of having mental representations that can cause intentional bodily movements. So let's look at these footnotes here. For 15 was referring to maxim of ends and maxims of action. The distinction between maxims of action and maxims of ends is implicit at metaphysics of morals. Some commentators have found that at least 3 kinds of maxim in Kant's ethical writings. Artwell found that Kant recognizes incentival, actional, and dispositional maxims. Potter offers a comparable interpretation distinguishing 3 elements of maxims: our moral character as moral agents, or our moral goodness or evil, the end or goal of our actions, and the kind of action itself. Dispositional, actional, incentival. So you see how this all comes into ways of these categories. Kant was big on the categories, that's for sure. Okay, let's see here. The practical sorites, with its leading maxim and descending hierarchy of sub-maxims, may seem like a contrived device for representing practical reasoning. But it's relatively easy to translate the whole business into the somewhat more familiar structure of final and intermediate ends. We need only think of the action named in the syllogism's conclusion as a means to be taken to achieve an immediate end. This end, in turn, can be seen as a means to achieving a more final end, and so on, until we reach the ultimate end. So, in the sewer's example, the agent jumps off the bridge as a means of shortening his life. But this action ultimately serves the end of happiness or self-love, ironically. The practical sortie is a way of expressing sequences of means to ends in the rationalist tradition of practical reasoning, where mental states like desires are seen as thoughts or representations in the mind. The power of representation. Ends are represented as things that are good to bring about, and contemplated actions are represented as means to achieving those ends. Contemplate actions, means to achieving those ends that are good to bring about. Now we get to intentions. Let's bounce over here to the chat. All right, hope you all are holding on. Let's continue here. Any questions or clarifications, be sure to pipe up in the chat and we'll address them here. The generality of maxims has been a point of controversy among recent commentators on Kant's moral theory. This controversy has some bearing on how the concept of intention can be supposed to apply in his theory of action. For reasons we need not pursue here, some have found it best to think of maxims as only the most general personal policies, or life rules. Life rules. They have recommended that actions be thought of as following not directly from maxims, but always through agents, particular, context-informed intentions. Their idea that maxims would be too general to be of much use in the context of action. So the principles upon which we typically act, they say, are intentions. They are always less general than maxims, and as such, they are adaptable to the particulars of our circumstances. So, whereas the maxims are subjectively conditioned, intentions are even less general, more specific, as they are adaptable. Something that's usually missing from, as we read before, with Kant's idealist tradition, to the particulars of our circumstances. Hence, according to this view, the connection between a maxim and an action is always mediated by an intention. I agree with this view, at least not on the point that the intentions upon which we act are not maxims. But I do not agree that maxims are only the most general policies of a person. From the preceding example of several maxims, hierarchically ordered in a practical sorties, it should be clear that maxims are capable of exhibiting various degrees of generality. In this, I agree with what seems to be the majority of Kant's recent interpreters. Kant used a word besides maxim to suggest intentions in acting. Words like, okay. In many contexts, however, it seems that maxim and English intention can be used synonymously. The important exception is when agents' intentions are to perform particular actions at particular times and places. For maxims, as principles, cannot refer to actions as particulars. So the maxim's not going to say anything about a particular time or place in a particular. In the simplest form of a practical syllogism, the agent's intention in performing the action will be reflected in the minor premise. Typically, that will be where a particular action is represented as capable of causing the object or condition the maxim represents as good. So, if the maxim is exercising is good and the minor premise is walking in the neighborhood is now an effective way to exercise, then the agent moved to action by these premises intends to walk in the neighborhood now as an effective way in order to exercise. Now, what if you were walking in the neighborhood as an effective way to exercise because you're walking a dog, and then someone was to deprive you of that, they shot your dog, let's say, then there would be an additional cause for relief here. Some might insist that the intention here should refer to the action only, or be expressed as just to walk in the neighborhood now. The end at which the action aims should not be represented in its intention, it may be said. The end at which the action aims should not be represented in its intention, it may be said. But it seems common for English speakers to think of intentions in acting as capable of referring to both means and ends. So intentions in English speakers referring to means and ends, it seems meaningful to ask someone, what is your intention? Even when knowing what she is doing or how she is acting. So here the intention asked about can be expected to refer not only to the known action, but also to the queried end. So here's an important thing linguistically for English. So it seems common for English speakers to think of intentions in acting as capable of referring to both means and ends. So it seems meaningful to ask someone, what is your intention, even when knowing what she is doing or how she is acting. So the intention asked about here can be expected to refer not only to the action, what is your intention, but also to the end. So by using the word intention, an English speaker typically wants to know just not what you're doing, but why you're doing it. The possible exception of which is sometimes used synonymously with maxim, Kant's term suggesting English intention do not seem theoretically significant. We read this before. Okay, translation stuff. Okay. It therefore seems correct to say that intentions, at least when they are intentions to perform particular actions, can include references ends. For that reason, intentions seem to be represented in the minor premises of practical syllogisms. Seem to be represented in the minor premises. Intentions. So the maxims are in the major premises, intentions in the minor. Intentions seem capable of referring to actions apart from their ends, however. And if we also allow that they can be general, then we are well on the way to seeing how maxims can be approximately the same as general intentions, not particular. In other words, maxim and intention can sometimes apply to the same mental representation. For example, I may form the general intention to exercise or to exercise more, without specifying in any intention why I would exercise or the particular way I would exercise. I might think that my becoming more physically fit is good, and then judge that by exercising I would become more physically fit. So I would conclude that exercising is good. The reasoning here takes the form of a practical syllogism starting with a maxim and concluding with a less general maxim via a minor premise about the effect of exercising. When I derive the maxim that exercising is good, there seems to be no reason why it cannot be said that I have derived a general intention to exercise. So the controversy over whether we act upon maxims or intentions does not pose a well-formulated problem. See, the controversy whether we act upon maxims or intentions does not pose a well-formulated problem. Intentions are the mental states of various degrees of generality, and so they can be maxims even if some intentions are too particular to be maxims. So depending on their particularity, intentions could be formulated as maxims. So finer lines of discernment. We're on to desires. Kant used desire in both a narrow and broad sense. The narrow sense of the term refers to desires based in the sense experience. The habitual desires in this sense are called inclinations, and Kant most frequently used this term when referring to sense-based desires. The broad sense of desire is somewhat less common in his writing, and it can refer to any motivational state. It is desire, as it is sometimes said, in the philosopher's sense. Motivational state is desire, but that's the philosopher's sense. Of course, forming or adopting a general intention doesn't necessarily mean that one will act on it. General intentions include New Year's resolutions, as well as those other good but ineffective intentions that pave the road to hell. Frierson explains a sense of desire relatively well in writing that when desire is taken in this sense, there are no actions that are not preceded by and caused by desires. And no desires. Where's the rest of that one? Oh, no desires that do not lead to actions, at least in the absence of external impediments. In contrast to customary English uses, Kantian desires mark an end to deliberation, not factors taken into account in deliberation. So desires mark an end to deliberation. Oh, okay, so at the end of the argument, that's the desire. Once you've reached what the desire is, you've ascertained that. That's the end of deliberation. The desires. All right, let's get back to the text. Kant's two words for desire in German are these two words. He was not completely consistent in the way he used them, but the former usually suggests sense-based desire. The latter most often refers to desire in general and is typically used in contexts where intellect-based motivational states are included in the discussion. For reasons we need not explore here, Kant was on the cutting edge of German philosophical psychology in defending a three-faculty psychology. This means that, unlike most of his predecessors, he saw the human mind as capable of three basic types of operation: cognition, feeling, and desire. Since his name for the mind's practical or motivational faculty was the faculty of desire, and any determination or state of this faculty can be referred to as a desire. It can therefore be correct to classify as a desire, in this broad sense, even what Kant called respect for the moral law, the special attitude effective in moral motivation. Respect for the moral law, which is effective in moral motivation. The rationalist tradition in which Kant was educated, whose figureheads in Germany were Leibniz and Wolff, explained that the human mind is a power capable of representing the world either cognitively or appetitively. In this tradition, cognitive mental states would represent their objects by implicitly applying concepts like true or real, while appetitive states would represent their objects with the concept of good. In more contemporary jargon, thank you, and speaking very loosely, the idea is that in cognition, we would represent these things as they are. Our representations are expected to adapt themselves to the world, while in desiring, we would represent things that ought to be. The world would be expected to adapt to our representations. Hence, desire is not assumed to be a psychological state distinct from the thought or representation of something's goodness. As if we think of something as good and then we desire it on that account, or vice versa. Rather, in this tradition, to desire just is to think of or represent something as good. So to desire just is to think of or represent something as good. That's what desire is. Think of or represent something as good. Another way to put the point is to say that desires have objects in exactly the way thoughts have objects, because desires are thoughts. They are thoughts of the goodness of their objects. Whoa. Kant was steeped in this tradition of philosophizing about desire, and he never criticized it. That is, he never objected to the idea that desires represent their objects as good, while aversions represent them as bad. His definition of the mental faculty of desire suggests that desires are representations. The faculty of desire is a being's faculty to be, by means of its representations, the cause of reality of the objects of these representations. Wow. So the desire drives the being to cause a reality of these objects to change to meet those desires or those thoughts. This definition does not say the representations of desire are representation of things as good, however, but in the second critique, Kant endorsed an old scholastic doctrine that we never desire anything not represented as good, and we are never averse to anything not represented as bad. So, that's an old scholastic doctrine. It's a maxim, right? Although he criticized this doctrine, he objected to it only insofar as it might restrict the idea of good to well-being or happiness. His view was that there is an important distinction to be made between representing something as good in the sense of well-being and thinking of something as morally good. It is worth pointing out here, before leaving the concept of desire, that maxims are correctly seen as desire in Kant's theory of action. Maxims are seen as desires. in Kant's theory of action. A representation of something as good is a desire. And as we have seen, a maxim is a representation of something as good. Hence, to have a maxim is to desire something, at least in the broad sense of desire. Kant pointed to another ambiguity in the scholastic formula. It is not clear, he wrote, whether it is to mean that in desiring something we have a basis for judging it good, or whether we first judge an object good and as a consequence desire it. He wrote, it may mean we represent to ourselves something as good when and because we desire it, or also we desire something because we first represent it to ourselves as good. Subsequent remarks show that Kant prefers the first reading of the formula that desiring determines good. Willing determines the good. So that's up for the audience to decide there, because now we're on to will. For Kant and his contemporaries, the will is the most important mental faculty involved in human action. Its role is comparable to the role of understanding in cognition. Kant explained that for human beings, practical reason is required for the derivation of actions from laws. Practical reason is required for the derivation of actions from laws or from principles. He then characterized the will as our capacity to act in accordance with a representation of laws. Hence, as he said, the will is nothing other than practical reason. We can take this to mean that whenever action follows from the premises of the practical syllogism, it does so through an operation of practical reasoning. This process is otherwise known as volition or willing. Act of your own volition, right? Of your own will. But deriving actions from principles is not the only operation Kant attributed to the will. In the three faculty psychology mentioned in the preceding section, the will is a division or sub-faculty of the more general faculty of desire. The will is called the higher faculty of desire because it is an intellectual faculty rather than a lower sense-based faculty. The same type of hierarchical division is observed in the cognitive faculty as well. What about the feeling faculty? Their understanding is higher, and the senses in sense-based imagination are lower. To Kant's way of thinking, the characteristic function of a higher faculty is to legislate a priori rules or concepts for the operations of its host faculty. The understanding is a higher cognition because it legislates the 12 categories for cognition of the world. Okay. In a similar way, the will is higher desire because it legislates a priori rules for actions. Legislating here means imposing governing concepts or norms, and these are a priori because they are not sense-based. In the cognitive faculty, an example of an a priori rule is legislated by the understanding is every event has a cause. So nothing happens for nothing. Here I pass over many instances where Kant seems to use the word will. Okay, Deleuze approaches this feature of Kant's system somewhat awkwardly. I think the distinction between the first sense of the world. All right, so we're getting some other. In the faculty of desire, the will legislates moral rules, like the universal law formula of the categorical imperative. See this? Universal law formula of the categorical imperative. This is within that idealist tradition. In Kant's view, then, the will has two important functions. As practical reason, the will runs the procedure of the practical syllogism. It derives actions from laws or principles. Our actions follow from maxims, that is, through acts of our own practical reasoning, our will. But the will, understood as what Kant sometimes called pure practical reason, legislates a priori imposing moral rules for action. An act of will in this case, as an act of pure will is an act of imposing a rule, call it an act of self-legislation, autonomy. Pure practical reason legislating a priori moral rules, self-legislation, autonomy. What a concept. One further point should now be made about the will. In human beings, the will is not perfectly rational. This means that its first function of deriving actions from principles, it does not necessarily adhere to the a priori rules for action that it imposes on the faculty of desire in its second pure function. But it is at least possible to imagine beings that do have perfectly rational wills, and they would be morally perfect. These would be angels, perhaps, or God. All right, we're on to choices and wish. Let's jump over here to the chat. See if you all are still here with me. Sure. This is a tough one to keep along with. I hope you all are still here. Seems odd them is still here. Good to see you still here. If you are still here, please make sure you hit the like so other people know that we're still here. Choice and will in the metaphysics of morals. Kant introduced a technical distinction between choice and wish. This distinction deserves more attention than it usually receives, I think. He wrote that the faculty of desire is a faculty for doing or refraining from doing as one pleases. Insofar as it is joined with one's consciousness of the capacity to bring about its object by one's action, it is called the capacity for choice. If it is not joined with this consciousness, its act is called a wish. Wow. Okay, so wish is a choice without consciousness, or a capacity for choice. Not joined with consciousness. To understand these ideas, it helps think of choices and wishes as alternative types of determination of the faculty of desire, or as alternative types of desire. Choices and wishes are distinguished by whether or not the subject has some consciousness or belief that she can act in a way that will bring about the existence of a desired object, an object that her maxim represents as good. Without such a belief accompanying it, her desire is a mere wish. Otherwise, it is called a choice. It must seem strange to English readers to see a choice classified as a type of desire, something comparable to a wish. English readers naturally think of a choice as something more like a decision than like a desire. But the desire state is often what Kant referred to when using his term, Willkür. The term now usually translated choice, faculty of choice, or power of choice. In his metaphysical lectures from around 1792, 5 years prior to the publication of the Metaphysics of Morals, we find the following distinction among the classes of desire state. Empty desires are called wishes, yearnings. The subject can himself be conscious of this emptiness. Effective desire is not yet efficient. One calls it as long as the opposite of my desire is also in my control. In those from lectures a few years later, just before Kant would have been writing the Metaphysics of Morals, we find there are namely two kinds of desire. Practical desire, an example, the representation of the possibility of making its object now actual. So the representation of the possibility of actuality, and a less practical desire, which one calls wish, a desire connected with a consciousness that it does not stand in our control to be able to actually produce the object. In the same place, we also find now the desire with respect to such objects of which we are conscious of having adequate powers for producing in an act of, and the faculty that corresponds to this desire. These statements show that Kant used the terms. Okay, so we're getting into a lot of semantics here. Okay, so by Kant's definition, a maxim connected with such a premise would be a choice, an effective desire, even if not yet efficient. Otherwise, a maxim would be a wish. So this is basically it. If it's a representation of something good, right, then the practical reason generates from an action of the maxim. If it's in the desire, let's see, the minor premise would indicate how to act. So the maxim, right, the practical reason generates an action from the maxim only when the latter, right, when the maxim is connected with a minor premise, which would indicate how to act about the object considered good in the maxim. So there's a minor premise that goes, the maxim says what should be done, the minor premise is how it's going to be done. By Kant's definition, a maxim connected with a premise would be a choice, an effective desire, even if not yet efficient. Otherwise, a maxim would be a wish. To think of something as good without having any idea how to bring it about is to wish for it. Wish to end all wars. For Kant's comment on the etymology, okay, we've been through the etymology enough there. Kant needed the distinction between choice and wish in order to respond to a criticism of his definition of desire. All right, so he had some of these critics. The internal contradiction referred to here lies in representing something as good to bring about. At the same time, one is convinced that it is impossible to act to bring it about. By the former, Kant sees it, that is, by wishing. A person works towards the production of the object by means of representation alone, from which he can, however, expect no success, because he is aware that his powers are inadequate to produce the object. So, mere wishes are also desires, but yet everyone would concede that he could not produce their objects by their means alone, by merely wishing. This, however, proves nothing more than there are also desires in a human being as a result of which he stands in contradiction with himself, in that he works toward the production of the object by means of his representation alone, from which he can, however, expect no success. Faculty of choice. Our ability to desire things we believe can bring about, that is, our ability to have effective desires, is our faculty of choice. This faculty would be the opposite, in a sense, of our faculty of wish, or our ability to have ineffective desires. English language, so those are ineffective desires or wishes. English language translators and interpreters have often referred to the former faculty as power of choice, but this is a technical mistake and is worth understanding why. Oh, Lord. The problem with these German philosophers, you got to deal with the translation, and English is so inadequate when it comes to the philosophy. All right, let's see if we can get through here and get back to maxims. So powers and faculties differ. So we'll look here. Kant insisted quite vehemently on the importance of the distinction between powers and faculties. To his way of thinking, the soul is a power, and cognition and appetition are its most basic faculties. Understanding the sensation are then sub-faculties of the soul. Understanding and sensation are then sub-faculties of the soul. The most basic faculties of the soul are cognition and appetition. And understanding and sensation are sub-faculties of the soul on the cognitive side, while will and sense-based desire are sub-faculties on the appetitive side. Ontologically, the power of the Wolffian soul is an actual force or effort exercise in its acts of representing. The soul's faculties of cognition and appetition are just the various possibilities or uses of this essential power. As you can see, how these 18th century philosophers definitely have a trying to put force to a soul, which is it a substance? Okay. All right. But he believed that human beings' insight into the world's most basic powers, including the power of the soul, is limited. So human insight. So he did not think that we are in any position to know that the single most basic power of the soul is a power of representation, as Wolff assumed. His view is that in our investigative world, in the sciences, we have arrived at what appears to be the world's most basic powers. But for all we know, the effects of these supposed powers may derive from a smaller set of still more fundamental powers. So what we now designate as a power must represent the limit of our understanding of an effect's explanation. Regarding the human mind, therefore, Kant's view is that in order to explain the full range of mental phenomena, we must posit three basic faculties of mind. These are indicated above, are cognition, feeling, and desire. We cannot see how these three could be reduced to one as a single most basic mental power. Yet reason compels us to think that the plurality of the mind's power must spring from some single root. So, due to the limits of our understanding, we are entitled to refer to them as the three powers of the mind. But insofar as we project ahead our possibly understanding the more basic unitary power from which they would be derived, we should see them as the three basic faculties of the mind, as three different types of exercise of the single power of the soul. So again, this is where we're reaching the limits of those categories, right? The innate categories and the faculties that if there were more fundamental powers, that it would change this whole syllogism, this whole approach. However, until then, we should see these three basic faculties as three different types of exercise of the single power of the soul, which isn't really unified in a way, in a definition, in an ontological meaning here. For the reasons it actually makes little difference to Kant whether cognition, desire, and feeling are called the three powers of the mind or its fundamental faculties, plural, fundamental faculties. Although their names do include the term faculty, at least in the case of cognition, desire, he still sometimes referred to them as powers. In regard to choice, however, this would be a sub-faculty of desire. Kant could scarcely have conceived of a power of choice. Here, the difference between power and faculty is clear and important, and Kant never used the word power in referring to choice. So what then is meant by his phrases? German. All right. Above, we reviewed Kant's understanding of will in the technical sense as the higher legislative faculty of desire. So will is the higher faculty of desire. In the sense of will is used to refer to objective practical reason imposing moral principles. His terms refer to the subjective side of the appetitive faculty. They refer technically to our cluster of psychological abilities dedicated to desiring, forming beliefs about how to act in light of our desires, and then acting. Those who believe in free will think we exercise our freedom in exercising this cluster of abilities. But even those who doubt that we have free will argue that we routinely exercise the cluster of abilities referred to by Kant's terms, Willkür Arbeitum, subjective and appetitive faculties. Their view is that our desires are the effect of prior causes, not under our control, and the same goes for our beliefs. They therefore say that our actions resulting from our exercising these abilities are likewise determined by prior causes, for which we have no control. Predetermined. So, from this, it should be clear that the question of whether we have free will cannot be decided by determining whether or not we can exercise what Kant referred to as subjective and appetitive. What was it? Faculties. My German's terrible, guys. All right, these terms were used by his contemporaries and by Kant himself in referring even to animals, who were, of course, denied any freedom of the will. So this means, as far as Kant is concerned, any conception of human freedom has to be developed independently of the concepts of willkür or arbitrium. The explanation or characterization of human freedom has to be, in other words, an explanation or characterization of human willkür or arbitrium as free. So again, subjective faculties and appetitive faculties. I'm not sure which, but human will. Again, English is quite an inadequate language for some of this German stuff here. So imperatives. The will's objective legislation presents actions to be good or bad to do. As well as known, Kant distinguished two types of imperatives, hypothetical and categorical. Only the categorical imperative is a principle of the will's objective or a priori legislation. Remember autonomy. The legislation of a hypothetical imperative always depends on some prior sense experience. In general, hypothetical imperatives say that it would be good to do some action, or that we ought to do it, because it would be an effective means of producing something we desire as a result of sense experience. Our desire here can be understood as a maxim, representing an object of experience as good. So a hypothetical imperative, a law, may be understood as conveying the logical force of the premises of the practical syllogism. When, in a maxim, I represent some object of experience as good to bring about, and in a minor premise, I recognize how I can act in order to bring it about, practical reasoning addresses me with a hypothetical imperative stating that I ought to act that way, the law. With categorical imperatives, by contrast, the logical force of the will's directive does not depend on my having thought of some object of experience as good in one of my maxims. A categorical imperative does not tell me how I ought to act in order to bring about something I desire. Rather, this is the crucial point of Kant's moral theory. A categorical imperative says that I ought to do something or not because of some intrinsic or formal feature of that way of acting. A central assumption of Kantian ethics is that it is always possible for us to act as we are commanded to act by categorical imperatives. So the Kantian conception of acting on maxims needs to accommodate this guaranteed possibility. It is easy to do this by making a further assumption about rational agents. We need to only assume that agents subject to categorical imperatives necessarily have a special maxim for this purpose. This would be a maxim to the effect that obeying the moral law is good, or that doing one's moral duty is good. Actions would not follow from maxims like this, though, because minor premise causal judgments. Actions would not follow from maxims like this through minor premise causal judgments, however. They would follow through judgments of subsumption, judgments presenting actions as instantiating the concept of obedience to the moral law, or the concept of doing one's moral duty. So boys are archaic words, instantiating. Only with the presumption of a special moral maxim can we understand how recognition of a categorical imperative command can be expected to make a difference in human conduct. There's a good one in here I wanted to read in the footnotes. Here we go. In the Metaphysics of Moral, Kant represented three civil authoritarians. Just one second. I'll just get a little drink there. This is quite a long chapter. In the Metaphysics of Morals, Kant presented the three civil authorities as a state as corresponding to the three propositions in a practical syllogism. The sovereign represents the law in the major premise. The executive authority represents the command of the minor premise as subsumed under the law. And the judicial authority represents the syllogism's concluding judgment or verdict. Nice. Here, the minor premise contains a command to behave in accordance with the major premise. It does not contain a statement that doing some action would cause some effect or would constitute some condition, yet the minor premise can still be so represented. Suppose the major premise is the maxim that paying your taxes is good, and the minor premise is that sending $100 to the Treasury will pay your taxes. The practicality of the syllogism makes it appropriate to read the minor premise as the imperative to send the $100 to the Treasury. The syllogism's conclusion would evidently then be the decision to obey that imperative. Wow, okay. So, paying your taxes is good, everybody. All right, so now we're on to reasons for actions. Imperatives are usually thought to provide reasons for actions, but so also are maxims. Reasons for actions. Imperatives are laws, but maxims can also provide reasons for action. Since the roles of these types of propositions play in practical reasoning are different, we have seen they apparently provide different types of reason for action. A broad distinction in types of reason for action has been attributed to the Scotch sentimentalist Francis Hutcheson. Justifying or normative reasons are said to indicate why an action ought to be done, while explaining or motivating reasons show why an action is done or could be done. Why or could be done. Imperatives and maxims in Kant's theory of action seem to correspond roughly to this distinction. An imperative is a reason I ought to do something, and a maxim is the reason why I did or would do or could have done something. Yet someone could plausibly explain why she did something by saying that it ought morally to have been done. So here it seems that justifying a reason might explain an action. And someone else might justify his action to himself or to others on the basis of his having a certain desire or maxim that the action would satisfy. Remember, a desire is a maxim, desire to do good. So here, apparently, an explaining reason justifies. An explaining reason justifies. An additional complication arises from the fact that imperatives and maxims are propositions of practical reasoning. Imperatives are derived from maxims by reasoning, as has been shown, but they are not derived directly. In the case of the hypothetical imperative, its supporting premises include both a maxim, desire, and a judgment to the effect some action or course of action will be effective in producing the desired object. So choices opposed to wishes. Again, imperatives and laws are interchangeable here. So supposing that someone acts as directed by a hypothetical imperative, someone acts as directed by law, Her reason for acting could plausibly be the imperative, or the relevant maxim, or even the intervening causal judgment. So 3 factors could be the cause. Someone's reason for sprinkling salt on the ice-covered sidewalk, for example, could be the causal judgment or fact that salt melts ice. Moreover, since maxims receive rational support from still higher maxims and more general causal judgments, any of these in the right context could plausibly be offered as the reason for someone's action. Something similar could also be said for actions commanded by the categorical imperatives. Remember, Kant's heavy about these categorical imperatives. For the possibility of acting on a categorical imperative presupposes a special moral maxim, as well as a judgment of subsumption. A judgment that an action has characteristics that make it morally required. So in the view of all this latitude, and what could count as a reason, the concept of a reason for action is, to say the least, hard to pin down. That's why we have litigation. Kant seldom wrote about reasons for action so described. In his vocabulary, practical laws and imperatives refer to justifying reasons. The former are usually called objective practical principles. For explaining reasons, Kant preferred terms like maxims and incentive, a term to be clarified in the following chapter. A maxim is called a subjective practical principle, while an incentive is called a subjective determining ground. Kant also recognized the possibility of a law serving as a maxim, or as an incentive, and so of justifying reasons serving as an explaining reason. Of a justifying reasons serving as an explaining reason. But this should not commit him to holding that actions are explained only by justifying reasons. So we see there's at least 3 factors here. Take a simple case of someone acting as a means of satisfying one of her sense-based desires. Her maxim might be that eating something refreshing would be good, and she might judge that eating the orange in the fruit bowl would be refreshing. In order for her to act on this maxim and judgment, it would not be necessary for her to draw a justifying hypothetical imperative as a conclusion. She need not say to herself or think, so, since I desire to eat something refreshing, and this orange would be refreshing, I ought to eat this orange. Her intention to eat the orange and her action can follow simply from her maxim and her judgment. No justifying reason need be involved in the explanation of her action. Nevertheless, a rational agent has a capacity for this. Rational agents can be conscious of the reasoning process by which they act. They can also be self-critical of the maxims that explain their actions. They can judge that a maxim on which they are contemplating acting is, for one reason or another, one they ought to act on, or one they ought not to act on. They can think to themselves about ways they are contemplating acting. I ought not to act on such maxims, and thoughts like this presumably can influence how they act. Finally, rational agents seem to have the capacity to rank competing practical positions as providing relatively better or worse reasons for action. They seem capable of recognizing more general maxims or more final ends as providing better justifications for action. There's efficiency here. They apparently can recognize unconditional justifications, the categorical imperatives, remember these are innate categories, as providing better reasons for action than conditional or hypothetical justifications. And these types of justifying thoughts also can conceivably influence an action. All of this shows, I think, that the concept of a reason for action is fluid and imprecise, and that we need not attempt to identify the exact form of reasons for action in Kant's theory of action. What will be important instead is that we understand the difference between justifying reasons and explaining reasons for action, and that we have some rough idea of how Kant's conceptions of imperatives and maxims relate to these. So, we're on to the justification and explanation. Sections 1 through 8 of this chapter showed how practical reasoning with maxims can explain action. Kant's theory has it that rational agents' actions are derived from their maxims, rational agents, by their wills, using the reasoning structure of the practical syllogism. This is good. Doing this will get that. So doing this is good. All right, let's see. So to explain an action in this theory seems sufficient to cite the maxim and minor premise from which it follows as a conclusion. For example, he is out walking because he thinks exercise is good, that's his maxim, and because he thinks walking is a way to exercise, minor premise. Alternatively, he's walking in order to exercise. Section 9, by contrast, showed how the practical reasoning with maxims can justify action. As Kant explained imperatives, at least valid hypothetical imperatives, they follow from maxims and causal judgments. To justify an action with a hypothetical imperative, we would cite a maxim of the agent and identify an action in a minor premise as a means of bringing about what is indicated in the maxim as good. For example, you ought to sharpen your knife, imperative, because its cutting better would be good, maxim, and because sharpening your knife will make it cut better, minor premise. Alternatively, because if you want your knife to cut better, then sharpen it. The task for the present section is to pose a problem related to the question broached at the beginning of this chapter. The question about justification and explanation. Practical reasoning seems suitable for both justifying and explaining action. The different examples we have just seen makes this apparent, but there is an important complication now to be considered. It is related to the concept of an imperative. If we were perfectly rational agents, there would be no problem in understanding how practical reasoning can both justify and explain our actions. For perfectly rational agents, the principles that justify actions suffice to explain them. We can think of perfectly rational agents. How many people are perfectly rational, right? As those who would desire all and only what they would recognize as good through pure practical reason. So these are angels, right? So their desires would be, in effect, causal laws that explain their perfectly rational conduct. But as we saw above, Kant assumed that the justifications for human actions are expressed in the form of imperatives. This is because, for us, what justifies action evidently does not explain it. Justification is one thing, and explanation is something else. And for us, the conditions for the one are importantly different from the conditions for the other. We can always act as we recognize we are justified in acting, but when we do, something besides the justification we recognize must explain our action. Otherwise, there would be no accounting for the counterfactual possibility of our having failed to act that way. As it happened, let us suppose that we did not act in the way we recognize we ought to act, but we still could have acted otherwise, even while recognizing the way we ought to act. Thus, our recognition of the way we ought to act cannot, by itself, explain our action. Something must be added to our recognition of the way we ought to act, something presumed to be present in the factual case and absent in the counterfactual case. This follows again from the presumption that the justifications are expressed in the form of imperatives. Kant's doctrine that the practical reasons justifications of human actions are imperatival seems to imply that what justifies action for us is not capable of explaining it. So justification is not capable of explanation. Yet what justifies an action should be capable of explaining it. Otherwise, justification is irrelevant. People see animals as incapable of acting rationally or on the basis of acknowledged rational justification. That's why they also see rational justification of animals' actions as pointless, irrelevant. They do not deny that animals sometimes take the most effective means to their ends, and efficient sometimes, and if they were moved to action by rational justification. What they deny is the talk of reasons and justifications even applies in the case of animal agency. They deny this precisely because they are convinced that animal actions are not explainable in the practical reasoning. Any justifying imperatives that practical reason might pretend to issue for animal agents would be pointless. We're back to Hume. David Hume, the empiricist, in the history of moral philosophy, applied a similar idea in arguing against rationalist moral theories. Thus, upon the whole, he wrote, "'Tis impossible that the justificatory distinction between moral good and evil can be made by reason, since that distinction has an explanatory influence upon our actions of which reason alone is incapable." Okay, so Hume's assumption here is that what justifies action must be capable of explaining it. His argument is that since reason has no explanatory influence on moral action, neither can it issue moral justifications. He made the point more generally also, even for non-moral action. Back to Hume, the empiricist. If reason has no original explanatory influence, 'tis impossible it can withstand any principle which has such efficacy, or ever keep the mind in suspense at a moment. Thus it appears that the justificatory principle which opposes our passion cannot be the same with reason. Reason is, and ought always to be, the slave of passions, and can never pretend to any other office other than to serve and obey them. Consequently, Hume continued, "'Tis not contrary to reason to prefer the destruction of the whole world to the scratching of my finger. 'Tis as little contrary to reason to prefer even my own acknowledged lesser good to my greater, and have a more ardent affection for the former than the latter." Says from a treatise of human nature. Kant's theory of action seems to say, contrary to Hume, as we saw, these are polar opposites here, or polar positions. Kant's theory of action seems to say, contrary to Hume, that practical reasoning does justify action. It does through applications of the practical syllogism issuing in imperatives, the laws. So the problem before us is to show how, according to Kant, practical reasoning would also be capable of explaining action. We must show how practical reasoning can have an explaining influence on action through the maxims of the practical syllogism if we are to see its imperatives, whether hypothetical or categorical, as relative to human conduct. The remainder of the book shall refer to this problem of justification and explanation. Good terms to know, and this is where if you see a problem in one of those two being used and then presumptions being made, this is a good hair to split. Offering and defending a satisfactory solution to the problem of justification and explanation will be the main objective of the chapters. Okay. Here's the solution that will be offered is that practical reasoning from maxims justifies actions through logical force. Okay, so the maxims justify the actions, but they explain them through psychological force. Maxims explain actions through psychological force. Next chapter begins by clarifying the solution, showing more concretely how it addresses the problem of justification and explanation. We began this chapter by showing how Kant defined action and how maxims serve as subjective principles of action. Subjective, right, with the subjective conditions. They do this by functioning as major premises of a structure of practical reasoning, a structure known historically as the practical syllogism. The relation between desires and maxims, as we saw, is that maxims are desires, or at least a type of desire. So maxims are a subset of desires. Like his rationalist predecessors, Kant considered a desire to be a representation of something as good. And this is just how maxims represent objects, ends, and the policies of actions. Our particular intentions in action can then be understood as reflecting minor premises of the practical syllogism. Someone intending to do X in order to bring about Y represents X as good because he judges that X would bring about Y, the minor premise, and thinks Y is good, which is maxim. We saw in this chapter also how practical reasoning with maxims can justify action. It is done by deriving imperative conclusions from maxims. Here we go. Conclusions like you ought to X from premises like Y would be good to bring about maxim, right? Y would be good to bring about. That's your maxim. And doing X would bring about Y. That's your minor premise. So you ought to do X. The problem posed at the end of this chapter is to show how these two functions of practical reasoning, the explanation function and the justifying function, are coordinated so that practical reasoning can explain the actions it can justify. This is the problem with justification and explanation. If this problem cannot be solved, then practical reason's justifications of action are irrelevant. Well, that brings us to the end of the chapter. So I salute you all for being along for this much of it. Boy, that's a long one too. Let's jump over here to the chat. All right. Let's see. Is anyone here? I think I lost everyone here. Anyone's there? Go ahead and pipe up in the chat. I hope those that are here were able to at least glean some better insight onto theory of action from Kant, but more importantly on the purpose of maxims and acting on the maxims. Where they apply is the more subjective conditions as opposed to laws which are more general, or imperatives as Kant calls them. But that being said, if anyone is still in here, please hit the like and be sure to subscribe and hit the notifications so you can be alerted of upcoming streams. And we're going to get back into the law of evidence on the upcoming presentations. I just want to break through to this about acting on maxims because maxims of law are truly where the rubber meets the road within our judicial system. And overlooking maxims is overlooking, again, the justification and the explanations of why judgments are made. So, that being said, I salute you all for being here, and we'll see you on the next one. Peace out.